Yeah, so thank you, Eric. As you said, the photos that we're going to be seeing tonight are kind of interesting in that they're not your typical railroad photographs where you would have a rail fan or a group of people that would go out and take photos of the railroads for their own purposes or perhaps to document them for a book or something of that nature. The photos that we have tonight are taken primarily between the 1940s, around 1944, and the late 1950s, early 1960s, by the Boston and Maine Railroad for the purposes of um, public relations, for the purposes of marketing, for the purposes of advertising new equipment and new routes and new services. And so they were taken mostly for a reason, as opposed to being sort of candid photographs. So go ahead and share my screen here and we can hop right into the presentation. So we call it the photography of George Hill. And the reason for that is George Hill was the PR photographer for the Boston and Maine Railroad for many years. As he was an interesting character. He came around to the Boston and Maine in about 1944. And Hill was a very accomplished photographer in a time period where photography was sort of becoming more of a hobby. It was becoming more of a commonplace thing versus back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, where by and large photography was performed by a small group of people with a set group of skills. Between World War I and World War II, photography really exploded because you had the commercial film market take off. You had, right after the Great Depression, you had a lot of affordable cameras, consumer grade cameras that could be used by everyday people. And then towards the end of the 1930s, you have the advent of color film, which was quite expensive, but after World War II became more common. So photography was becoming more of an appreciated form of art, and not only for things like newspapers and official use, but for marketing. And photography and photographs and photograph magazines became a really important marketing tool. And the railroads seized on this pretty quickly. Yeah, so Mr. Hill, he died in the late 1970s, but he was born in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he was a very accomplished photographer. Not only did he work for the Boston and Maine, but he was also a Boston Globe photographer. He also took pictures for the Boston Post, the Herald Traveler, the New York Times, and the Worldwide Photo Service. So he was a cameraman. He was very accomplished in that profession. And of course, it's interesting to note too that, of course, the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central were jointly managed. They weren't jointly owned, as commonly believed. They were jointly managed in the late 40s and early 50s. And because of that, Hill was also the photographer for the Maine Central as well. And so we will see a little bit of Maine Central in this presentation. So this is the person behind the camera, by and large, that you're going to see these photos tonight. So we'll start with a non-railroad photo, but something that was very important for the Boston and Maine, the Boston Garden, of course, the hub of the Boston and Maine system, North Station in Boston, and right above North Station, the Boston Garden. And so here we have a game between the Bruins and Detroit. This was taken in 1944. And it kind of kicks off our presentation, showing that these photos were not railroad centric all the time. You know, it wasn't always locomotives and passenger cars or freight trains. A lot of the times the Boston and Maine was sending Hill out to take pictures of the things that the trains brought people to, things like Bruins games at Boston Garden. And so it's very interesting to see this focus of railroad photography, not entirely on the railroad itself, but on the services that the railroad provided. Of course, people was always a popular subject, especially in things like the Employee magazine. And a lot of Hill's photos ended up in the Boston and Maine Railroad's Employee magazine. And so we have a gentleman here. He's the engineer of an FT type freight locomotive. Once again, in 1944, right when these locomotives would have been in wartime service on the Boston and Maine. This is particularly on the Portland division. I believe this was taken somewhere around Kennebunk. I do have the notes, but I don't think I have them pulled up on the screen here. So I don't have the information right in front of me, but this is Portland Division engineer. in the cab of an FT locomotive, about 1944 when this was taken. And Hill was interesting because he would be dispatched by the Boston and Maine, or he would go out on his own and take pictures in specific areas. And so you'll see a lot of pictures in the collection of negatives that we have from Hill, taken in the same areas around the same date. So he would go to Portland and spend a day or two in Portland taking pictures, and then he'd go to Concord and take some pictures in Concord. So he was definitely planning these trips out to make the most of his abilities to take pictures for the Boston and Maine. Really nice shot at Portland Union Station of a Maine Central Pacific number 467. Not too far from the 470 there that was mentioned earlier. Hill, of course, would take pictures for both the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central, and they would be posted in the Employee magazine. They would also appear in newspaper articles and advertisements as well. And so this is an interesting shot in 1944, showing a Maine Central passenger train departing Portland. And for quite a while, Maine Central Power did run into Boston on passenger trains. We see a lot of pictures of Maine Central Pacifics in Boston, and also Boston and Maine locomotives in Bangor. And so it's kind of illustrating that joint management, which was going on with pooling locomotives from the two railroads. This shot was taken in Somerville, Massachusetts, in the hump yard there. This is a staged photograph. This is displaying the hand signals that would be used with a lantern by yard crews. And so a lot of the photos you'll see in these negatives are staged photographs. They were either done, to show off equipment. They were done as profiles of people for the employee magazines, or they were done for marketing purposes. And so sometimes they are natural. Sometimes they're natural with a bit of artistic license in there, like the train would slow down so Hill could get a picture or something. And sometimes they're outright staged. And then this is one of those staged photographs. But this is actually a B&M brakeman. So it's a little bit authentic for sure. And I believe this did appear on the cover of one of the employee magazines in the mid 40s. Another shot, another human shot. This is a little bit more of a natural shot. This is a clerk in the yard at Mechanicville, New York, on the western end of the Boston and Maine system. Just kind of showing the people and the tools they would use in their everyday jobs, the clothes they wore, the types of things they were doing for the B&M, so then they could be shown off in the employee magazine. Another interesting shot. So not only did Hill take pictures of people on the Boston and Maine working for the Boston and Maine, he also took a lot of pictures of people working the industries that the Boston and Maine served as a way to show the public what the Boston and Maine was doing for industry in New England. This is in Greenfield, New Hampshire on the Hillsborough branch. This is the EC and WL Hopkins feed mill, which was in Greenfield, New Hampshire. Huge business for the railroad, feed and grain, especially in New Hampshire. And the Hopkins mill was a very high profile customer on the Hillsborough branch. They got a ton of cars. It actually burned in 1976, but right before it burned, it was a railroad customer up to the end. And so this is back in 1944. We see an employee of the mill here unloading a wooden boxcar full of corn, it looks like. And so what they would actually do before the advent of covered hoppers is they would use boxcars in loose feed service, and they would unload them similar ways like this. Of course, covered hoppers started to come into play in the late 40s, early 50s, and it was a lot more effective at shipping loose and bulk feed and grain in a covered hopper than it would be in a boxcar. But before that, it was done this way. So it's interesting to see. The Hopkins mill also shipped out product. They didn't just receive raw product. Here they are shipping out some of their bags of dairy feed. And it shows how the boxcars would have been loaded by the employees of the mill. So Hill's shots are really nice that they show us not only the railroad portion, but the customers as well. All these small customers and businesses that were doing business on the Boston and Maine system at that time. A few more shots of the Hopkins mill here shows the feed bags piled up to the roof. When the mill burned in 1976, it was such a catastrophic fire that it actually lowered the level of nearby Zephyr Lake by several inches. They pumped so much water out of the lake to put the fire out. I think the fire burned over the course of a weekend. But you can kind of see, industries like this that had, held all these dry goods for so long, were definitely susceptible to fire. And quite a few feed mills and feed elevators did burn, were lost to fire, including the one on the waterfront in Portland, if I remember correctly. Another shot, just more shots of the Hopkins mill. Here they are loading the bags themselves of poultry mash before being loaded into the box cars like you saw previously. And then sewing up the bags before they would be loaded. All these jobs, all these industries, they would be changed pretty quickly. You started to see the advent of different types of containers, different types of bags. So cloth bags being sewed up by hand, full of feed and poultry mash and that sort of thing. Definitely emblematic of the time, but of course Hill was out to get as many pictures as he could of just the role that the Boston and Maine was playing in these small towns. And here are the owners, Don and Charles. I believe Don is on the left and Charles is on the right. Hopkins, they were cousins. And so it's kind of interesting to see the owners of the mill in sort of a stage shot, but inside the Hopkins mill there in Greenfield, New Hampshire. Hill also took a lot of pictures of the Boston and Maine's shop facilities and the facilities that were used not only to build, but repair and replace equipment. This is Concord, New Hampshire, the Concord Shop Complex, which was well known for being a major carpentry shop. A lot of wooden equipment was serviced there, everything from coaches to boxcars and cabooses. And so here we see a group of carpenters working on a wooden caboose deep in the caverns of Concord shops in Concord, New Hampshire, back about 1944. Of course, it wouldn't be railroad photography if there weren't locomotives, and Hill did take definitely many pictures of locomotives. This is out in Mechanicville, New York. This is a wartime oil train with EMD FTs. The Fitchburg route of the Boston and Maine from Mechanicville, through to Boston and then Portland by way of Ayer, Massachusetts, was a major route for wartime traffic, specifically oil going into Boston and then out by ship. And it was such a major route that it was often compared to an oil pipeline. And so during the war, Hill took a lot of pictures of oil trains on the Fitchburg division. This is one of them with an ABBA set of FTs, the brand new F units that the Boston and Maine had acquired during the war, which started to replace some of the larger steam locomotives. He also got a shot of the same train in East Deerfield Yard. This is the same day, East Deerfield, Massachusetts, major yard on the Boston and Maine. You can see an G10 class steam switcher behind the locomotives there in the background. And another shot in the cab of an FT on the Fitchburg division approaching the Hoosick Tunnel. I believe this is west of the Hoosick Tunnel. And they're about to meet one of the R1 mountain type locomotives. So kind of a neat shot from the cab of a diesel approaching one of the steam engines that would eventually be replaced by this new technology. One of the most scenic shots on the Boston and Maine, specifically the Fitchburg division, which appeared in a number of photographs, was the Zoar Curve in Massachusetts, which is just east of the Hoosick Tunnel. And this is an eastbound oil train rounding Zoar Curve with 4 FTs again, and a solid block of oil cars coming around Zoar Curve. And if you look about mid-train, you can just see the roof of the Zoar station there. If you drive to the Hoosick Tunnel today, this is right about where you leave the main road, and then you follow that back road up to the tunnel. It's mostly overgrown today, though. I don't think you could replicate this shot if you tried. Another really nice shot, another Persian shot. This is Concord, New Hampshire. This is a flagman on a local freight. Of course, the flagman was responsible for protecting the rear of the freight trains when trains had stopped on the main line. The flagman would walk a number of feet or a relative distance behind the end of the train with his flag and his track torpedoes, which you can see clipped to his flag. He would place those on the rails, and so any trains coming up on the rear of the train would hit those torpedoes, make a loud bang, and it would tell the engineer to slow down or stop because there's another train stopped ahead of them. And so the flagman was a really important position on the railroad, specifically before radios became really common on freight trains, because it was important if the train had stopped for following trains to know that there was a train ahead of them. And so this is him. This is what he would have done. You get to see some of his equipment, some of his attire. Just a really nice shot, portrait shot by Hill, taken in Concord, New Hampshire. Another interesting aspect of the railroad that wasn't covered a whole lot, at least in common history, but it's covered quite extensively by the PR departments of the Boston, Maine, and other railroads, were camp trains. Back in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s, summer camp specifically, was super popular. Families in New York City and other places would ship their kids literally up to New England for the summer, to places like New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, and they would stay there sometimes the entire summer. And so the railroad did a big business with camp trains, usually heavyweight Pullman coaches coming out of places like New York City. And so this is in Portland, Maine, one of the big stopping points for the camp trains, where they would then be broken down and sent off in other directions. Some kids heading up to various camps in Maine. Kind of interesting too is if you listen to, I believe on our YouTube channel, or maybe it's one of our podcasts, we have an interview with 3 dispatchers that worked for the Boston and Maine. And one of them, Arnold Wilder, is talking about the camp trains. And when they would stop in Portland, the camp trains were kind of interesting because for a lot of kids, it was their first time being away from home unsupervised. And there were counselors, but the counselors for the most part were in their teens or 20s. And so the kids had a lot of free range. And so the trains would stop at Portland Union Station. The kids would run inside and buy candy or cigarettes or whatever they wanted. And the railroad was always trying to like keep these kids in one place so they wouldn't run all over the place. So kind of an interesting aspect of railroading that doesn't really get covered a lot in common rail fan history, but definitely interesting nonetheless. This is a really nice shot. I believe this is near Woburn or Wedgemere, Massachusetts. This is the Alouette, crack passenger train jointly operated by the Boston and Maine and the Canadian Pacific between Boston and Montreal, passing a section crew as it heads up the New Hampshire Route Main line, eventually for Concord, New Hampshire, and then up the Boston, Concord, and Montreal to Plymouth, rather, and then over to Wells River, Vermont, before heading up the Canadian Pacific to Canada. Waving from the rear platform is the conductor. That's a buffet lounge car, Canadian Pacific buffet lounge car, which was almost always on the rear of the Alouette until that passenger train was discontinued as a luxury passenger train in 1954. Of course, the Boston, Maine, and the quote unquote Flying Yankee are pretty ubiquitous. The real name for the unit is 6000. The Flying Yankee was one of the trains that operated between Boston and Bangor. But here it's operating as the Cheshire between Boston and White River Junction by way of Keene, New Hampshire on the Cheshire branch. And so this was one of the long tenures that this unit operated in, was as the Cheshire. Of course, it's possibly going to be relocated and restored if the new effort is successful, but it is still around. It's in Lincoln, New Hampshire, on the property of the Hobo Railroad. Really interesting shot. We're at the south end, or rather the west end of Rigby Yard in South Portland, Maine. This is taken from the tower there, and we're looking towards Rigby Yard in the distance. And if you look, you can see a track coming in from the left and joining the main line. The track coming in from the left is the old Eastern route, which ran from Boston to Portland by way of Newburyport, Portsmouth, Kittery, Berwick, Biddeford, and then up into Portland. But in 1944, the Boston and Maine decided to abandon the portion of the Eastern route from South Portland to Biddeford. And so we're looking at the Eastern route where it comes in and joins the Western route the day that they cut the connection there at South Portland. And so you can see all the linkage to the right, which would have been for all the semaphore signals and everything, controlled out of the tower. And you can see they've the same day they've started to pull the rails on the eastern route where it um, comes into South Portland. Now the eastern route was still operational between Berwick and Portsmouth, and then from Portsmouth to Boston. They only cut the section from Biddeford to Portland in 1944. And then from 1944 to 1952, the Eastern was in service from Boston to Berwick, and then trains would have gotten on the Western route for the rest of the journey into Portland. Manchester, New Hampshire was another city with quite a bit of semaphore apparatus. This is one of the towers in Manchester in 1944 when they started to replace the semaphore signals with automatic block signals. And so we see the semaphore tender, the yard man here in the tower at Manchester with the semaphore apparatus that he would have controlled in his day-to-day job. This was also on the cover of one of the employee magazines, if I remember right. And then there's a really nice shot here of Manchester Yard, looking north on the New Hampshire route main line. You could just see Manchester Union Station in the center background. And you can see all the semaphore signals. And if you look closely, a lot of the semaphore arms have been removed. And so this is the day that they were retiring the semaphores in Manchester Yard. And there is a dog kennel, doghouse you can see in the foreground. We know it's a doghouse because in 1944, there was an article in New Hampshire Profiles magazine about Bozo, which was the yard dog in Manchester, New Hampshire. And there's a picture of him standing with a B&M crew member. And when I scanned this negative, I zoomed in on that and I said, that's a doghouse in a dog bowl. And so that has to be Bozo's doghouse. So kind of neat little bit of history there. But the nice thing about Hill's photos is if you zoom in on them, the details go on and on and on. I mean, you can see people, you can see cars, you can see buildings, various pieces of rolling stock, and they're all big negatives. So they all scan up very nicely and very clearly. And so they provide a really wonderful look at the B&M in this time period. Even though they were taken mostly for marketing and for public relations purposes, for the modeler, for the historian, there's a lot to see. And people that are interested in these places that aren't even railroad centric, I've shown this picture to people from Manchester, and they can't believe how many landmarks you can still see and how many are gone. So pretty incredible stuff. This is Boston North Station, snow melter. Interesting piece of equipment that was used by the Boston and Maine to clear the tracks in the terminal. Basically what it was a large snowblower with a conveyor belt, and then the conveyor belt fed into a large tank, and the tank would have been heated with steam from the locomotive pushing it, and it would have melted all the snow, and then the water would have been disposed of. And so this is the snow melter being pushed by an 080 switcher locomotive in the terminal in Boston. And in the mid-1950s, when the Boston and Maine was retiring a lot of their steam locomotives, some of the last steam engines that they had were actually used in snow melter service, including the 3713, the Constitution, which is super famous. I'm sure you all know about that engine. That was used as a snow melter in Boston in 1955 and 56. So kind of interesting bit of history there. This is Mr. Charles Kame. He was the superintendent of the Portland Division in his office in Dover, New Hampshire. If you've read High Green and the Bark Peelers, the famous book about the Boston and Maine, which was written by R.M. Neal in 1950, Charles Kame is mentioned quite prominently as being a really effective boss on the railroad. He's praised quite heavily by those that talk about him in that book. He was an interesting person. He was very involved in everything that happened on the Portland Division. He was also personally in charge of the Rockingham race trains on the Manchester and Lawrence branch because that was part of the Portland Division. So yeah, he had a lot of irons in the fire, Charles Kame. But it's nice that we have a portrait of him, courtesy of Mr. Hill. A couple more miscellaneous shots of various employees at the Portland Division headquarters there in Dover. The multi-story station building in Dover, which is gone now, was the division point for the Portland Division. It was relocated from, I believe, Salem, Massachusetts at some point. in the late 1930s or early 1940s. And so Dover became the division point for the Portland division for quite a while. We head back into the Boston area, East Somerville, the Boston Engine Terminal, or New Boston Terminal, as it was known in different parts of its history. A couple steam locomotives here laying over in the terminal there. This is a P2 class Pacific locomotive specifically, but there's some moguls and consolidations in the background mixed in. Various passenger commuter locomotives, which would have been serviced at East Somerville for use out of Boston. Another nice shot at North Station before the highway overpass and before any of the clutter came in. This is one of the R1 mountain type locomotives preparing to depart with a passenger train. And there's a steam switcher at right, which is probably switching out possibly milk cars or baggage cars or even passenger coaches. And the large building to the right is the Hotel Manger in the background. That was a fixture in the North Station complex for many years until it was demolished. This is over at Boston Engine Terminal in East Somerville. One of the R1 locomotives are, it's actually, I think this is one of the R1s, or maybe it's one of the Limas. I don't remember. No, this is an R1, yeah, 4100, being power washed at the facilities there in East Somerville. Not too sure how often the B&M washed their locomotives, or if this was just done for PR purposes or for the Employee magazine. It can be hard to tell with the hill negatives. But nonetheless, kind of a nice shot of just locomotive servicing on the Boston and Maine. This is probably a shot that's recognizable to many of you, looking north on the New Hampshire Route main line in Concord, New Hampshire. The signal tower there, CTC signal tower, was brand new at this point, just built in 1944. This is 1944 when this was taken. And you can see a bit of Concord Yard in the background. You can also see a coal unloading facility at left for the gas holder complex. Coal would be unloaded there. It would be burned in that furnace house you see. And then the coal gas was pumped up into the large brick circular gas holder building, which is still there in Concord today. And inside that gas holder building was a big metal tank. And when the tank was full or empty, it rose up or out of the ground. It actually stayed below ground. And when it was full, it rose up into the structure itself. And the gas from that structure was piped all around the city of Concord. And there's a big effort right now to try to save that building. The yard tower is still there today, the signal tower. It's been discussed back and forth whether or not it's going to be demolished as part of the new CSX ownership of cleaning up the what's left of all these unused buildings on the system. But it is still there today. This is a fascinating photograph, and it's definitely a period photograph. So this is 1944, right at the end of World War II, when the Allies were all cooperating. And so this is East Somerville, Boston Engine Terminal. We have a contingency of B&M officials and Soviet officials touring the engine terminal at East Somerville. Obviously, the United States and the Soviet Union were allied during World War II. This is right at the tail end of World War II. And so there was some Cold War suspicion going on, but nothing like you would see in the late 40s up to the 1960s. And so there was a lot of cooperation between the two countries. And so we have a group of Soviets here touring the B&M facilities towards the end of the Second World War. I don't have the actual information as to who's a B&M and who's a Soviet in this picture. It is labeled on the negative, but I don't have that with me right now. And that's one of the 3700 class Pacifics they're looking at. This is a neat shot. This is a 44-ton General Electric diesel switcher in East Hampton, Massachusetts. And the caption for this negative was reopening the East Hampton line. So I don't know if the East Hampton branch was out of service for a little while during World War II or whatnot, but apparently this is a ceremony reopening that line in 1944. And you get a nice look at some of the technology that was coming on in the 40s, which would start to replace the steam engines pretty quickly. This is Peterborough, New Hampshire, the station agent at Peterborough. Really nice classic New England Almost looks like he's out of Thornton Wilder's Our Town or something. Just to look at the B&M employee that you would have had as your local representative in your small town, New Hampshire, or anywhere else that the B&M served for that matter. Hill was great at taking wonderful portraits of these people. And thanks to him, we get a look at life in New England, not only through the Boston and Maine lens, but through the lens of small town life. It's really nice that we have that. This is a wartime shot in North Station. This is a big display they had. I'm not sure if that number, because this is right towards the end of World War II. I think that number 144 is employees that had been discharged from the military. At this point in time, there was a lot of B&M employees that served in the war. But I don't remember if that number is, I think that number is those who had been discharged by the time this photo was taken. Yeah, an interesting portrait of the B&M's contribution to the Second World War. This is an interesting shot, Wakefield Junction in Wakefield, Massachusetts. They're unveiling a plaque for the 100th anniversary in 1944 of train service to the town of Wakefield, Massachusetts. So kind of a celebratory photograph here. Hill would be dispatched to take pictures of celebrations that had to do with the railroad as well. And so we see a lot of events and a lot of photographs of various things that the B&M was tied into in that respect. Another thing the B&M was tied into very heavily was Rockingham Park. And I mentioned earlier that Charles Kame was in charge of these trains. Rockingham Park in Salem, New Hampshire on the Manchester and Lawrence branch was an institution for many years. And there was a spur which came off of the Manchester and Lawrence branch and wound around the end of the racetrack, you can see in the background, and terminated as 2 tracks just before the grandstand. And so this is where the trains would stop and race goers would get on or off the trains. The Rockingham racers were so busy that it was a major operation of running these trains. The coaches, when they weren't being used, were stored on sidings all up and down the line as far north as Derry, New Hampshire. And they would actually take all of the Pacifics, couple them together, and then run them in reverse back to South Lawrence so they could service all the engines at once, and then bring them back up the line to Rockingham Park to bring the people home at the end of the race days. So major operation on what is essentially a branch line at that point in time. And it's been said that the trains to the park were pretty jovial and pretty happy. And the trains coming home from the park were a bit more subdued because quite a few people had lost their shirts and bedding and that sort of thing. So kind of a funny anecdote. But this is right at the end of World War II. I believe this is actually after the war had ended. So people needed to escape, definitely. Just a nice wintertime shot of the station at Plymouth, New Hampshire. We have our meetings there usually twice a year. We just had our May meeting there, and we're going to have our October meeting there, I believe. This would be on the Boston and Maine's Boston, Concord, and Montreal line, or the White Mountains Division, main line, where the branch to Lincoln, New Hampshire, and the main line to Wells River would have split just north of this photo. So at this time, this was a major stop on a busy mainline railroad. If you've seen Minuteman Tales, our YouTube series, you might recognize this gentleman. This is the stencil cutter at Concord Shops in Concord, New Hampshire. His job was to cut the stencils out, which would then be used to paint things like the Minuteman logo on equipment in Concord Shops. Hill also took a lot of film as well as still negatives. And we actually have a DVD available through the B&M Historical Society with the films of George Hill. So a lot of what you've seen today is actually in film version as well. So it's kind of interesting he was doing both at that time. But just a classic, almost looks like a Norman Rockwell kind of situation. Just a really neat photo from the 40s. We're back in East Somerville at Boston Engine Terminal right in 1945, and you can start to see a little bit more diesel power leaking in. We have an Alco switcher to the right. In the middle, we have the Ingersoll Rand 1100, which was a unique locomotive for the Boston and Maine. There might have been a few others, maybe 1 or 2 others in existence, but it wasn't a common diesel type at all. And then behind that, an E7 type passenger locomotive, which came in towards the end of World War II, up into the early 1950s, and was the mainstay of long distance passenger trains on the B&M until the RDCs came around. We have the turntable operator at Boston Engine Terminal. Unfortunately, I don't have her name in front of me, but it is listed on the negative and also on the rear of the Highliner magazine that we just put out through the society. She was employed there during the war and after the war. She held on to her job at Boston Engine Terminal, turning the locomotives on the turntable there. Kind of a neat shot. This is the construction of the Boston Engine Terminal, so BET, which replaced New Boston Terminal, which would have been the terminal before then. This is in the late 1940s. There's not a whole lot of pictures of Boston Engine Terminal being constructed, but you can see in the background, that's the, I can't remember if that's the Fitchburg, Maine in Cambridge or not. But construction shot, we have quite a few negatives that Hill took of the construction of that facility in East Somerville. Lawrence, Massachusetts, Andover Street. This is a laborer. His job was to clear snow from switches and signals. Just another job position that doesn't exist today in most places on the railroad, but Hill was there to document it when it did exist and was quite important to the Boston, Maine, especially when the winters were as heavy as they used to be. These kinds of jobs were super important. North Chelmsford, Massachusetts, on the New Hampshire Route main line, right where the Stony Brook branch comes off. This is the tower at North Chelmsford, which was retired not long after this picture was taken in the mid to late 40s. And the reason it was retired, you can see here, automatic block signals were coming in to use on the Boston and Maine, replacing semaphore signals. And so, signal towers were not as common once automatic block signals came around. And so Hill was there to document the semaphore signals to the left and the new automatic block signals, which were coming into use. Interesting shot, definitely a public relations shot in North Station on track 22. It's a savings bond, some sort of U.S. savings bond ceremony or award being given to the Boston, Maine. Doesn't seem to impress the passengers too much who are disembarking from North Station there. But yeah, just an interesting post-war shot. Hill took a lot of shots like this, which at one point were probably important and well-known, but kind of have become a bit more obscure as time has passed. But if you go back and read the old employee magazines, you could probably find out exactly what was going on here. Really nice shot. This is the Alouette as it's departing North Station in Boston behind 3700 class Pacific in the wintertime. And of course, as was discussed earlier in the presentation, the snow trains. The snow trains were probably the most important PR thing the Boston and Maine had going for it, especially in the post-war period. It's been commonly cited that the snow trains began on the Boston and Maine in 1931. The very first snow train ran to Warner, New Hampshire on the Claremont branch. And during the Depression, the snow trains were very popular ways for the Boston and Maine to use equipment on the weekend where it normally wouldn't be used, commuter equipment. And they became popular social occasions for young people to travel up into New Hampshire and other places and go skiing, places like Plymouth, New Hampshire, Lincoln, New Hampshire, North Conway, Greenfield, New Hampshire. These were all places where the snow trains ran at one point in time. After the war, they became even more popular because, of course, you had a lot of people coming home from the war, young people looking to get married and date and that sort of thing. So they were very popular social occasions. Hill took a lot of pictures of people getting on and off the snow trains. He took a lot of pictures of people on the snow trains. And some of the people we can trace, which is interesting because almost all the pictures that Hill took of people on the snow trains has a name and an address. And so this woman here, I don't remember what her name is, but It had her name, it had her address as Melrose, Massachusetts. So I Googled her name, and unfortunately, I was able to find an obituary from 2020. She had passed away 3 years ago, but in the obituary, it specifically mentioned that she enjoyed riding the snow trains in her youth. And so here we have a photo of her doing that as a young person, enjoying life, getting out and being social, going out and enjoying the wintertime sport. And then we have at the end of her life an obituary which says just how much she enjoyed doing that. And we have that sort of saved forever because of Hill, thankfully. And it's almost uncanny. The smile is exactly the same. It's really interesting. So tying these different pieces of history together, becomes more useful when we have things like Hill's photos and all the information that goes with them. And so sometimes you get to really see bits and pieces of life that usually you don't in the railroad hobby. It's really rewarding. This is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in one of the car shops. A couple gentlemen changing out a set of wheels from beneath a coach. Another really great just labor photo of people working on the Boston and Maine, doing the jobs they did every single day, jobs which wouldn't be around much longer for a lot of these people, as the railroads changed and decreased in a lot of ways. This is, I believe this is Medford, Massachusetts. This is an SW1 EMD switcher locomotive. This was taken specifically for an industrial development booklet that was circulated by the Boston, Maine. And so we kind of a nice look at the diesel locomotives that the Boston, Maine was using and the freight service that they were using them in. Now, in the late 1940s, the city of Chicago had a railroad fair, and railroads from all over the country came to show off their technology, their advertising, and the Boston and Maine was one of them. And so Hill went out to take pictures at the railroad fair, and the Boston and Maine was included in the Eastern Railroad exhibit. And you can see an artistic rendering of an E7 locomotive with both the B&M and the Maine Central logo on the front, showing off the co-management of the railroads at that point in time. This is another shot taken by Hill on one of the snow trains. This is in North Conway, in the cab of an E7 locomotive, a Portland Division engineer showing one of the attendees the whistle cord in the cab of the locomotive. Probably a stage shot for the Employee magazine, but post-war B&M snow train, it doesn't really get much better than this. Hill took a lot of pictures of equipment, new equipment, as it was being used on the railroad. This is the wash rack at Boston Engine Terminal, which would have been used to wash locomotives, particularly passenger locomotives and rolling stock. And so built by the Whiting Company, kind of an interesting shot of that piece of equipment when it was new on the Boston and Maine. And then we have shots like this, which are also in the negatives, which are interesting. This is in Suncook, New Hampshire. This is the upside down covered bridge, as it's sometimes called, similar to other upside down looking covered bridges. But this is on the outlet of the Suncook River where it meets the Merrimack River in Suncook, New Hampshire, on the Suncook Valley Railroad. This was not the Boston and Maine when this photo was taken. And I don't know if the Suncook Valley Railroad, because there's about 20 negatives of this bridge from all different angles in the collection. I don't know if the Suncook Valley just didn't have their own photographer and just asked the Boston and Maine to come up and take pictures of this bridge, or if it was done in conjunction with the Suncook Valley, the state of New Hampshire, and the Boston and Maine, because the Boston and Maine would have been the railroad that the Suncook Valley interchanged with. But we know that this bridge was, they were concerned about the status of this bridge. This was actually one of the reasons that the Suncook Valley started to fall apart is this bridge specifically. And so maybe they were, the state of New Hampshire was asking the Boston and Maine to go take pictures of it. We don't really know, but regardless, it's kind of interesting. Concord Union Station in Concord, New Hampshire, commonly cited as one of the most beautiful structures in the state of New Hampshire and probably one of the most sorely missed. It was torn down in 1960 by the Boston and Maine as they started to cut back on their long distance passenger trains and their facilities that they had to take care of. And when this building was torn down in 1960, the state of New Hampshire, the city of Concord, and the Boston and Maine all basically came out and said it was a good thing. It was progress. They put a shopping center there, which is still there today. So, a lot of people mourn these buildings today, but back then you look at it and they were happy to get rid of stuff like this. For the most part, there were definitely people that were upset about it. But interesting perspective for sure. But Hill took a lot of pictures of Concord Union Station because Concord was a very important B&M city. This is Leroy Hutchinson. Many of you know David Hutchinson, his son. Leroy was a freight agent for the Boston and Maine when this photo was taken. His fellow employees are celebrating, I believe that's either his wedding or the birth of his son, David. I don't remember which. But kind of an interesting shot of somebody who's very tied in with the Boston and Maine. Leroy is also the founding member of the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society. The charter was signed on his kitchen table in 1971. And so in the Hill negatives from the B&M, we have one of our prominent founders, which is very cool. This is Nashua, New Hampshire in 1952, I believe. This is the Eisenhower presidential train in Nashua. Quite a crowd has come out to see Ike. You can see him standing on the rear platform there of the coach. There's an S3 switcher in the background, Boston and Maine, right at Nashua Union Station. So Hill went out to take as many pictures of this train as he could, and there's quite a few in the collection. Up in Laconia, New Hampshire, back on the White Mountains Division Main Line, the station at Laconia, of course, well known and beloved by many. And today, the rail bike operation for the Hobo Railroad operates out of it. This is a signal maintainer at the crossing there by the station in Laconia, New Hampshire. And the station at Lakeport, New Hampshire, also in Laconia. A motor car coming down the line, kind of a neat wintertime shot. And over to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So 1952, the Bud cars started to come in. Obviously, self-propelled passenger cars. They could be operated from either end of each coach. And they could be coupled together and operated as multiple units from one control stand. And so they eliminated almost overnight the need for passenger trains hauled by separate locomotives. And so the Boston and Maine saw this as a huge cost-saving initiative and a modernization effort, and ended up rostering the largest roster of RDCs in the world. And many of them are still around in various forms today. But this is the station at Portsmouth on the Eastern Route main line. At this point in time, the Eastern Route would have gone from Portsmouth up into Berwick, and then this train would have gotten on the Western Route going to Portland, as we saw earlier when they cut the Biddeford to Portland section. Interesting shot, very curious. This is Worcester, Massachusetts. This was sort of an advertising effort for shipping loose flour on flat cars in removable tote containers. Not something that stuck around very long because pretty soon covered hoppers came around and made it just a lot easier. But for a brief period of time, they experimented with shipping loose flour this way instead of covered hoppers before covered hoppers became more common. Really curious shots for sure. This is Haverhill, Massachusetts on the Western Route main line, the very last steam-powered passenger train to depart Haverhill going into Boston in 1955. Whole town has shown up, including the mayor wearing a top hat. And interesting perspective of basically what was the end of steam on the Boston and Maine in the mid-1950s. Inversely, we have the very last steam-powered passenger train to depart Lowell. This is at Middlesex Station in Lowell, Massachusetts, heading into Boston for the very last time. By the 1950s, Hill was still prominently the photographer for the Boston and Maine, but things on the B&M would start to change. And Patrick McGinnis would come in as the president of the B&M in 1956. And you start to see Hill's photography sort of fade out after that point. Probably not directly because of McGinnis's influence on the B&M, but he ended up retiring in the early 60s. Hill did. So his photography doesn't go much beyond that point. This is the Concord River Bridge in Lowell. This is, or maybe it's the Nashua River Bridge. I don't remember which. But this is a wreck of the Red Wing, which was a passenger train operated between, I believe it was also Montreal to Boston, but this one took the northern instead of the White Mountain Main Line. Yeah, it wrecked on the bridge. It was kind of a mess. I don't remember exactly what happened, but this is an SW1 freight locomotive, and it ended up splitting a wooden baggage car in half as part of the wreck. So you can see that baggage car cut in half here. This is a separate instance and separate location. This is North Billerica at the B&M's Billerica shops. A group of steam locomotives being scrapped, 1955, 1956. The last runs of steam on the B&M were in 1956, and after that point, any steam locomotives that were still around were scrapped pretty frequently after that. And so they took them all out to Billerica and they lined them up in 54, 55, and 56. And as scrap prices improved, they ended up scrapping basically all of them. I mentioned Pat McGinnis earlier. Here he is the day he was sworn in 1956 as president of the B&M. Controversial figure for sure. He was seen by many as sort of ruining the Boston and Maine in some ways. But he also did a lot for the Boston and Maine that, people gloss over. The GP9 locomotives were bought during his presidency. The completion of the RDC roster was done during his presidency. He ended up going to prison for pocketing funds when the B&M sold their stainless steel passenger car fleet to the Missouri Pacific. So definitely a controversial figure for sure. But when you weigh him against, other railroad figures, even in more recent times, there's a lot of black and white there for sure. Probably one of the more well-known wrecks on the Boston and Maine was the wreck at Swampscott, Massachusetts, in the late 1950s, and it was a mess of a wreck for sure. There was a heavyweight passenger train from Portsmouth, which was heading into Boston, that had stopped at Swampscott Station. I believe it was an RS3 and a number of passenger coaches, and they were stopped at the station. It was snowing heavily, and the signals were somewhat covered by snow. But the passenger train sent their flagman out behind the train to watch for any other trains. Well, the flagman lit a fuse and held it up, and a train of RDCs from Danvers, Massachusetts, came up on the stopped passenger train but didn't stop, and rear-ended the heavyweight passenger train at speed. And there were a number of fatalities on the RDC coaches. I don't believe anybody on the heavyweight coaches was harmed. But the RDC train, the first RDC, was completely destroyed, and there were a number of fatalities, unfortunately. And you can see, I believe, this is that first RDC to the left and the second one to the right, pretty much leveled from the floor up. Yeah, it was a real mess. And the B&M, they responded as quickly as they could and cleaned up the mess. But Hill was there to take a number of photos of the aftermath. On a more bright note, this is East Somerville, the hump yard, when the new 50-foot 77,000 series boxcars were delivered. These would have been blue with black doors, and the B&M quote-unquote McGinnis Herald, which was designed by Herbert Matter. He was a well-known graphic designer, and he designed that logo for the Boston and Maine. It wasn't designed by Lucille McGinnis, as a lot of people say it was. It was Herbert Matter. But these are the boxcars on the hump yard in Somerville when they first came in. And an RDC 1 there in East Somerville at the engine terminal, wearing that new logo, that new corporate scheme of the Boston and Maine. F. Nelson Blount was mentioned earlier, probably one of the more well-known and prominent figures in New England railroading and steam preservation in the United States. That's him in the middle, shaking hands with George Hill, the photographer for a lot of the photos you saw in the dark suit to the right. Blount was sold, I believe, the Boston and Maine's 1455, a 260 Mogul, which was one of the last steam locomotives in use on the Boston and Maine. In 1956, the 1455 was sold to Nelson Blount for like $1, I believe, and put on display at his Edaville Railroad in South Carver, Massachusetts. And so this is the dedication ceremony for the 1455. This was the very first standard gauge locomotive that Nelson Blount acquired, and he was hooked after that and started buying locomotives from the United States and Canada as quickly as he could get their hands on them. And that became the foundation for what would become Steamtown, USA in North Walpole, New Hampshire, and later Bellows Falls. And a good amount of that equipment is still around at Steamtown National Historic Site in Scranton, Pennsylvania. But the 1455 was sold by Edaville to the Cape Cod Railroad, and then it ended up at Danbury Railway Museum, where it is today in Danbury, Connecticut. As I said earlier, the GP9 locomotives came onto being on the Boston and Maine in 1957 during McGinnis's presidency. This is the class leader, number 1700. The B&M had 1700 through 1749, and this is the 1700 at the North Billerica shops in Billerica, Massachusetts. They were called the Bluebirds. I'm sure most of you know that, but that's because they had a blue, white, and black coloring. B&M also experimented with a number of different blue, black, and white paint schemes on their locomotives during the late 1950s. This is an F2 type locomotive in Cambridge, Massachusetts, painted up in sort of an experimental paint scheme, which wasn't applied to more than a few locomotives, but they were experimenting with corporate redesign in that sort of mid-century Mad Men type era, where marketing and flashy new era designs were becoming a lot more prominent in marketing and advertising. This is another F2 locomotive in the earlier paint scheme, the pre-war, or the post-war rather, Minuteman paint scheme. About to take the very last B&M steam locomotives on the property west. They're going to head to Pennsylvania to be scrapped. So this is just about to depart Somerville, Massachusetts. Another wreck on the Boston and Maine that's well known was the wreck at Medford of, I think this is the Red Wing again. The Red Wing wrecked, I think, 3 times in the 1950s. This wreck particularly happened at the overpass there in Medford. I don't remember the cause specifically, but it has been determined. I think it was excessive speed through a slowdown, and had something to do with possibly a speed restriction sign being removed, or a speed restriction notice not being paid attention to by the train crew. But the crew was killed in this specific wreck. But yeah, that locomotive was also totaled in the wreck. As we head towards the end of the presentation, we start to see the late 1950s on the Boston and Maine. The new era and the old era sort of coming to head here. An old era wooden caboose on the Boston and Maine becoming very uncommon in the late 1950s. And one of the brand new 77,000 50-foot boxcars. This is Ayer, Massachusetts. And down in the tunnel at Salem, Massachusetts, opening the new Salem Tunnel when it was built in the 50s to replace the old Salem Station and the old Salem Tunnel. That's President McGinnis in the center, about to cut the ribbon. And as new things came around on the Boston and Maine, the old started to go away. And one place that really saw its prominence and importance fade in the 1950s and early 60s was Concord, New Hampshire, specifically the Concord shops, which closed in 1959. This is right on the eve of that closure. Some shots of the cavernous complex at Concord shops. Hill went up to take a number of pictures of the shops before they were sold, and a number of them were torn down for redevelopment, or they were sold to industries to be used privately. Some of them are still there today, but very few still remain in the modern era. Another look at that complex there as it started to fade away. Concord lost its Union Station in 1960, still held a large freight yard into the 1970s, but its days had been numbered for a while as a prominent railroad location. But Hill was there to document the end of it for sure. A splash of color. This is East Somerville, one of the brand new steel cabooses. The Boston and Maine had built, a number of them were built from wooden cabooses by International Steel. I believe this one specifically was a rebuild from a Concord shops built wooden caboose into a steel caboose. A lot of these are still around. You can still see them in New Hampshire and other places, private ownership, people, camping them. There's a number of them in Tilton, New Hampshire at the Caboose Village there. A few of them up in Meredith at the Winnipesaukee Scenic. I think there's another one in Lincoln on the Hobo Railroad. But yeah, pretty ubiquitous with the Boston and Maine, these cabooses. Cutting the ribbon again, Pat McGinnis at the station, the brand new station in Concord, New Hampshire, downtown, which replaced Concord Union Station. These little stations were built of concrete and brick and glass, and were not very glamorous, but sort of reflected the change in passenger service. Passenger service, long distance, that needed big stations was going away. Commuter trains were becoming popular still, but certainly fading somewhat to the highway and to other things. And so the B&M was cutting costs wherever they could, and these new stations was one way to do that. This station is gone too. It was torn down in the 90s, I believe. Our last shot here tonight is an interesting shot in Lebanon, New Hampshire, in the cab of an E7 passenger unit heading into Boston, heading down the Northern, and coming in the opposite direction is another passenger train with the Maine Central E7 locomotive. And so kind of an interesting shot. In the far distance, you can see a steam locomotive on a siding doing some freight work. So we have a shot of a B&M passenger locomotive, Maine Central passenger locomotive, which was jointly owned, operated rather, not owned, by the Boston and Maine in that time period. Steam-powered freight in the background, very emblematic of what Hill took in his negatives at that time, just showing the everyday on the Boston and Maine from the 1940s up until the early 1960s. I do want to say a little bit about the collection before we go. The collection was actually given to us by Alan McMillan Jr. and David Hutchinson, who took care of the collection for a number of years. But before that, the collection was owned by Alan McMillan Sr., who got it directly from the Boston and Maine's PR department files. And so these collection negatives, which there's probably about 6,000 negatives in total. You've only seen 90 shots today, including prints as well. There's a number of prints. There's a number of aerial shots. The prints go back even further to the early 1930s, late 1920s. But the negatives themselves, about 6,000 of them, date from 1944 to about 1962. And so thanks to Dave Hutchinson and Alan McMillan Jr., we have that collection in the B&M Historical Society archives. It's been organized, it's been sorted, it's being stored safely, and we've scanned a number of them to be used in magazines and publications. But there is a full list of those negatives. So if you're interested in reproductions or purchasing prints from the archives, you can find that list online and see what's in it, because there's a whole heck of a lot of interesting stuff in there. So that's all I have tonight. I hope you enjoyed it.